10 places in California that shouldn't exist. In 1905, a group of engineers made one small mistake on the Colorado River. It took them 2 years to fix it. By the time they did, an entire sea had been born in the middle of the desert. It wasn't supposed to be there. Nature never intended for water to fill that basin. And yet, for decades, people flocked to its shores, built resorts, brought speedboats, and called it the California Riviera. Today, that same sea is dying, poisoning the air for 100 miles, and scientists still argue about what to do with it. That's just one place. There are 9 more like it scattered across California. Places that defy logic. Places that should have been swallowed by the desert, wiped out by disaster, or simply never built in the first place. Some were created by accident. Some were built by obsession. One was built by a single grieving woman who believed that if she ever stopped construction, she would die. By the end of this video, you'll understand why California has more impossible places than anywhere else in America, and there's one on this list, near the very end, that even geologists still can't fully explain. Stick around, because number 1 will change the way you see the entire state. Let's start the countdown. Number 10. A ghost town frozen in time, sitting 8,000 feet up in the eastern Sierra, in a place so harsh that even the wind seems to be trying to erase it. Before the gold rush, this stretch of California was empty high desert. Freezing winters. Blistering summers. No water source worth mentioning. No reason for anyone to stay. Then, in 1859, a small gold deposit was found, and within 20 years the town of Bodie exploded to nearly 10,000 people. Saloons lined the streets. Miners fought over claims. Men were shot in the street almost weekly. Bodie became so notorious for violence that a young girl, upon learning her family was moving there, is said to have written in her diary, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Gold towns like this were supposed to disappear. When the ore ran out, the miners left, and the buildings were usually torn down, burned, or reclaimed by nature within a decade. Bodie didn't do that. Instead, something strange happened. The town emptied out almost overnight in the 1940s, and everyone just left their belongings behind. Dishes still on tables. Toys in bedrooms. Price tags still hanging in the general store. Today, Bodie sits in what park rangers call a state of arrested decay. Nothing is restored. Nothing is added. The buildings are simply kept exactly as they were the moment people vanished, frozen mid-collapse. Rangers have reported visitors mailing back rocks and artifacts they took from the town, along with letters describing bad luck, accidents, and nightmares after taking them home. Officials call it the Bodie curse, and there's a drawer full of those apology letters sitting in the museum right now. But that's not the strangest part. Because Bodie isn't even the most impossible town on this list. Not even close. Number 9. A neighborhood in the Mojave Desert with no zoning laws, no property taxes, no running water, no electricity grid, and no government at all, home to thousands of people who call it the last free place in America. Before it was anything, this land was a World War II Marine artillery training range called Camp Dunlap. Soldiers fired shells across empty desert flats for years. When the war ended, the military left concrete slabs behind, the foundations of barracks that were torn down, and simply abandoned the land. Nobody expected anyone to want it. It was blazing hot, waterless, and remote. And yet, over the following decades, people started showing up. Retirees who couldn't afford a mortgage. Artists. Veterans. People running from something. They began living directly on top of those old concrete slabs, calling their new home Slab City. There are no addresses here. No mail delivery. No police patrol the interior. Residents build their own solar panels, dig their own wells, and elect no one, because there is no one to elect. What makes it even stranger is who ends up there. Some residents are millionaires who chose to walk away from everything. Others are homeless. A world-renowned folk artist spent decades single-handedly building a mountain of adobe and paint just outside the community, using only donated leftover paint, turning a lifeless hill into a rainbow visible from space on satellite maps. For years, Slab City functioned almost like its own experiment in what happens when a society removes every rule. And what investigators later discovered about that experiment was more unsettling than anyone expected. Because in a place with zero law enforcement, disputes get settled a very different way, and there have been disappearances out here that were never fully investigated, simply because there was no jurisdiction responsible for looking. Number 8. A single house, built continuously for 38 years, with staircases that lead straight into ceilings, doors that open onto walls, and a design so confusing that workers got lost inside it and had to be found by other workers. Before construction began, the widow who built it was one of the wealthiest women in America, having inherited a fortune connected to a famous rifle company. After her husband and infant daughter both died within a few years of each other, she reportedly visited a psychic medium who told her that the spirits of everyone ever killed by her family's rifles were haunting her, and that the only way to appease them was to never stop building her house. If the hammering ever stopped, the medium supposedly warned she would die. So she built. Every single day, for nearly 4 decades, carpenters worked around the clock, 7 days a week, even through holidays. She personally redesigned rooms overnight, tearing out walls that had just been finished because she'd had a new vision. The result is a mansion with over 160 rooms, staircases that go nowhere, doors on the second floor that open into open air with a 30-foot drop, and a chimney that stops several feet short of the ceiling, apparently by design. When she finally died in 1922, construction stopped that same day, mid-nail, exactly as the story had warned. To this day, no blueprints for the house have ever been found. Historians believe she may have never had one at all, designing every twist and dead end from instinct or instruction that only she understood. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Because in recent years, paranormal investigators using thermal cameras have recorded temperature drops in specific rooms that line up almost exactly with where the psychic told her spirits were gathering. Skeptics call it coincidence. Employees who've worked there for decades say otherwise. And that's still not the most unexplainable structure on this list. Number 7. A perfectly white dome, built with no metal nails, in the middle of nowhere, based on blueprints its creator claimed were given to him by beings that weren't human. Before this structure existed, this patch of Mojave Desert was simply flat scrubland near a dry lake bed. Then, in the 1950s, an aerospace engineer who had worked on classified government aircraft projects suddenly left his career and moved out here alone. He told friends he had begun receiving detailed engineering instructions in his sleep, and that these instructions came from extraterrestrial contacts he'd made during his work on secret aviation programs. Using those instructions, and no power tools of any kind, he built a wooden dome measuring nearly 40 feet high, using a design based on sacred geometry, without a single metal nail anywhere in the structure. He claimed the shape and materials created a natural acoustic and energy chamber capable of recharging human cells, regenerating tissue, and even reversing the aging process. He called it a rejuvenation machine. He never got to prove his claims. He died in a car accident just days after finishing the structure, on his way to unveil it publicly for the first time. His files, notes, and detailed research on the science behind the dome disappeared and have never been recovered. Today, the structure still stands. Visitors describe a strange humming resonance inside when they speak, caused by the dome's unusual acoustics. Sound healers now hold sessions inside it, insisting the space produces measurable effects on brainwaves. Scientists remain divided. But that's not even the biggest unanswered mystery buried in the California desert. Because just a few hours from here sits something that shouldn't exist by any law of physics we understand. Number 6. A flat, cracked lake bed where 300-pound rocks move across the ground entirely on their own, leaving long trails behind them, without a single person, animal, or machine ever seen touching them. For over a century, this happened without anyone catching it in the act. Before any explanation existed, ranchers and prospectors who passed through this remote valley reported the same eerie sight: heavy stones, some weighing more than a grown man, sitting at the end of long grooves carved into the dry lake bed, as if they had been dragged. But there were never any footprints. No tire tracks. No wires. No signs of tampering. For decades, theories ranged from magnetic fields to alien intervention to secret military testing, because this valley happened to sit uncomfortably close to a classified naval weapons range. Locals whispered about it for generations. Scientists set up cameras for years and caught absolutely nothing, because the movement only happened once every few years, during a narrow window nobody could predict. Then, in 2014, researchers finally caught it happening, almost by accident. And what they discovered was so unexpected that even the scientists were stunned. It turned out that during rare freezing nights, a thin sheet of ice forms over shallow standing water on the playa. When the sun rises and that ice begins to break apart, wind pushes the floating ice panels forward, and those panels act like blades, quietly shoving the rocks along the slick mud underneath, sometimes for hundreds of feet. Mystery solved. Except for one detail nobody can fully explain. Some of the largest rocks left trails that curved sharply, doubled back on themselves, or stopped and restarted in a different direction entirely, movement that doesn't perfectly match the ice theory, and that researchers still haven't been able to recreate in controlled tests. Number 5. A resort town built on the shore of that accidental sea we mentioned at the very beginning, a place that was once called the Next Palm Springs, and is now one of the most photographed abandoned places on the entire West Coast. Before the collapse, this town had it all. In the 1950s and 60s, developers marketed it as a glamorous desert resort, comparing it directly to the French Riviera. Yacht clubs lined the water. Celebrities supposedly vacationed here. Water skiing tournaments drew crowds by the thousands. Billboards across California promised buyers a slice of paradise, and thousands of families bought vacation homes and retirement lots sight unseen. Nobody fully understood, or perhaps nobody wanted to admit, that the sea beneath all of it was an accident of engineering, trapped with no natural outlet, slowly filling with agricultural runoff, pesticides, and salt with nowhere to drain. As the decades passed, the water grew more toxic. Massive fish die-offs began washing millions of dead fish onto the beaches at once, the smell reportedly reaching Los Angeles, nearly 150 miles away, on certain wind patterns. Entire flocks of birds started dying by the tens of thousands from botulism outbreaks tied to the poisoned water. Tourists stopped coming. Property values collapsed overnight. Families abandoned their vacation homes so completely that furniture, dishes, and even cars were left behind, exactly like Bodie a century earlier. Today, the shoreline isn't sand. It's a crust made of crushed fish bones, so dense in places that it crunches underfoot for miles. And here's what almost nobody knows. That same toxic dust being kicked up off the dry lakebed as the sea continues shrinking has become one of the worst air quality hazards in the entire United States, linked to childhood asthma rates in nearby communities that are among the highest recorded anywhere in the country. A resort built on a mistake has quietly become a public health emergency, and the state still hasn't agreed on how to fix it. But that's still not the darkest secret in the desert. Number 4. A stretch of California where the U.S. Navy detonated experimental weapons for decades, directly on top of one of the largest, oldest collections of ancient rock art in North America. Long before any fences or checkpoints existed here, Native American communities had been carving symbols into the volcanic rock of this valley for thousands of years, some estimates suggesting drawings dating back over 10,000 years, among the oldest human markings anywhere on the continent. Then, in the 1940s, the United States government quietly seized nearly 1 million acres of this land to build a top-secret weapons testing facility, developing missiles, rockets, and classified ordnance throughout the Cold War. For decades, almost no civilians were allowed anywhere near the area, and the ancient carvings sat inside an active military bombing range, protected only by the fact that almost no one could get close enough to disturb them. Access today still requires a background check and a military escort, and visitors are warned that unexploded ordnance may still be buried in the surrounding hills, decades after testing ended in certain zones. What makes this location even stranger is the sheer contradiction sitting inside it. one of humanity's oldest attempts at spiritual expression, preserved by accident, inside one of America's most advanced weapons laboratories. Researchers have found symbols here that don't match any known style used by tribes anywhere else in North America, leading some archaeologists to believe an entirely unidentified culture may have created them before vanishing without a trace. And that unsettling detail, an entire civilization that simply disappeared from California and left nothing behind but symbols nobody can translate, connects directly to something even bigger further down this list. Number 3. An entire city that appears on old maps, road signs, and a functioning post office, built by a single con man who had already been arrested for fraud multiple times before he built it. Before this place existed, this patch of Mojave Desert along an old rail line was nothing but sand and creosote bushes, so remote that travelers sometimes died out here from dehydration before reaching help. Then, in the 1940s, a man calling himself a doctor, despite having no verified medical credentials, arrived and declared he had discovered natural healing mineral springs on the site. He built a small settlement, complete with a castle-like building, hotel, church, and general store, and named it after what he claimed was the very last letter combination in the alphabet, marketing it as the final word in health. He convinced hundreds of desperate, often elderly and terminally ill visitors to travel out to his remote settlement, where he charged them for mineral baths, cancer cures, and rejuvenating treatments that had no scientific basis whatsoever. Authorities eventually discovered he was operating almost entirely without any medical license, and previous fraud convictions in other states. But by the time they caught up to him, an entire tiny town had grown up around his lie, complete with its own zip code. He was eventually removed from the property by federal marshals, but the buildings never disappeared. The town still exists today, technically still shows up on some maps, and travelers still occasionally stumble upon its crumbling castle-like structure sitting alone in the open desert, assuming they've found some abandoned military base, with no idea they've actually found the remains of one man's decades-long con. But even that story pales in comparison to what's coming next, because the second place on this list isn't just strange. It's a place the United States government has spent almost 80 years trying to keep the public from fully understanding. Number 2. An island less than a mile and a half off the coast of one of America's biggest cities, surrounded by freezing, shark-patrolled currents so violent that federal officials once considered it completely escape-proof, and used it to hold the most dangerous prisoners in the entire country. Before it became a prison, this rocky island had already been used as a military fort, then briefly as a lighthouse station, sitting largely useless in the middle of one of the busiest bays in the country. Then, in the 1930s, the federal government converted it into a maximum security penitentiary specifically designed to house the most notorious criminals in America, men considered too dangerous or too high-profile for any other prison in the country. The government told the public that escape was mathematically impossible. The water surrounding the island stayed dangerously cold year-round, hiding currents strong enough to sweep a grown adult out toward the open ocean within minutes, and officials claimed no prisoner could survive the swim to shore. Then, in June of 1962, 3 inmates vanished from their cells overnight, leaving behind painted papier-mâché heads in their beds to fool the guards during nightly checks, along with a raft they had built themselves from stolen raincoats. They were never found. Not their bodies. Not their raft. Nothing. Officially, the government still classifies them as presumed drowned, and technically still wanted, to this day, over 60 years later. But that's not the strangest part. Because letters have surfaced over the following decades, allegedly written by one of the escapees to family members and to police departments, along with a photograph submitted decades later that a family claims shows 2 elderly men standing together in Brazil, bearing an uncanny resemblance to 2 of the missing inmates. The FBI officially closed the active case in 2018, but the U.S. Marshals Service kept it open, and to this day, no one can say with total certainty whether those 3 men actually died in that freezing water, or whether they pulled off the only successful escape in the prison's history. That mystery alone would be enough to end most documentaries. But we've saved the strangest place in California for last. Number 1. A hill in the middle of the desert that started as one grieving, homeless man's personal apology to God, built entirely from junk, adobe mud, and tens of thousands of gallons of donated paint, that grew for nearly 3 decades until it became one of the most visited unofficial landmarks in the entire country, and was almost bulldozed by the government twice. Before this hill existed, this stretch of desert near the shrinking, toxic sea we talked about earlier was empty, cracked earth, considered worthless by everyone, including the federal government that technically owned it. Then, in the 1980s, a man who had struggled for years with addiction and homelessness arrived here alone, reportedly attempting to build a hot air balloon shaped like his idea of heaven, hoping to fly toward God as a form of prayer. When the balloon failed and collapsed, he refused to give up on the idea entirely. Instead, he started building upward, using the only materials he had access to: junk metal, old tires, straw, adobe clay, and thousands of gallons of donated leftover paint. He worked completely alone, sleeping in a hollowed-out truck at the base of his creation, for almost 30 straight years, slowly building a hill nearly 50 feet tall and 150 feet wide, covered entirely in bright, hand-painted messages of love, forgiveness, and hope, visible from satellite photographs taken from space. Local officials tried to have it demolished at least twice, citing concerns that the structure, built from scrap metal and mud with no engineering permits whatsoever, could collapse on visitors at any moment. Both times, public backlash and growing national attention stopped the demolition. Eventually, government geologists were sent out to formally test the structure's stability, fully expecting to condemn it. What they found instead left them stunned. The layers of adobe clay, applied by hand over decades with no blueprint, no engineer, and no formal construction plan of any kind, had somehow formed a surprisingly stable, self-supporting structure, unintentionally similar to construction techniques used in ancient earthen buildings that have survived for centuries. A man with no training, working entirely alone out of grief and obsession, had accidentally built something that professional engineers admitted they couldn't have easily replicated on purpose. He passed away in 2014. But true to the story of almost everywhere on this list, the moment he stopped, the site didn't disappear. Volunteers arrived from all over the country to maintain his work, determined to keep his message standing exactly as he left it, in the middle of a desert that was never supposed to hold anything at all. 10 places. 10 stories that shouldn't have happened, in locations nature and common sense both argued against. A sea created by human error that became a health crisis. A mansion built out of fear that a woman would die the moment the hammering stopped. A dome built from instructions its creator swore weren't his own. Rocks that moved by themselves across a valley bordering a classified weapons range. A fraud so committed it became a real town with its own zip code. A prison island that may have let 3 men slip away into the ocean and simply vanish from history. And a lonely, grieving man who built a mountain by hand in the middle of nowhere, and accidentally created something engineers still can't fully explain. Almost every single one of these places shares the same haunting thread. They were all built by someone who refused to stop, long after logic told them to. And in almost every case, the moment the builder finally did stop, the moment the widow died, the moment the engineer crashed his car, the moment the artist on the hill closed his eyes for the last time, the place itself refused to disappear with them. So maybe that's the real question worth sitting with tonight. Is California actually filled with impossible places by pure coincidence? Or is there something about this particular stretch of land, wedged between an ocean and a desert, and a fault line that never stops moving, that pulls broken, obsessive, grieving people toward it, and lets them build things that were never supposed to exist? If you've ever stood in one of these places yourself, you already know they don't feel empty. They feel like they're still waiting for something. What would you have done if you were the one standing there first, staring at empty desert, deciding to build anyway?